It's so wonderful to see you. I hope that we are fully engaged without headphones or laptops, but we are ready to plug in and be a part of this very significant moment in your college journey. So, in 100% transparency, I am so intimidated to be sharing the stage with Dr. Perry. For those of you that have been in my office, you've heard me like, I don't know what to say. I hope I don't embarrass Morehouse, because literally she is a whole like MacArthur genius, like for real. But what I would love to begin this conversation with is for you to talk to us about your biography. And for those of you who are in my sociology course, who have taken sociology, we talk about this concept of the sociological imagination, right? Which is the intersection of biography and history. That you're able to see how your personhood is impacted by the broader context, right? So I would love for Dr. Perry to talk to us about her beginnings in Alabama and how that led her to all of the wonderful things that she's done and where she is now at Harvard, if you would oblige me.
Sure, thank you. First of all, thank you so much for being in conversation with me. It is a joy and an honor. My biography. So I was born in Birmingham, Alabama, 1972, long time ago. And it was an important, the time is important for the shaping of who I would become. It was a time, so 63 was the Children's Crusade. That's the moment in history where you see all of the children in Birmingham protesting desegregation, the dogs, the kids and jailed in the fairground and the like. So it literally was just 9 years, and it was also 9 years after the 16th Street Baptist Church bombing in 1963. So that's the context in which I was born. My grandmother, who is the first person I stayed with, was a domestic. She cleaned homes for a living. She gave birth to 12 children. She sent all 12 to college. My grandfather died before I was born, but he made shoes. My parents were movement people. They were organizers. And so I sort of grew up at I was born in this cross-section, right? The movement, the tradition, which my grandmother was a wonderful exponent, and this aspiration, right? This idea that we were not to be resigned, limited, diminished by virtue of the legacy of Jim Crow, right? It's kind of this notion of the movement in every aspect. When I was like 3.5, we moved to Milwaukee with a bunch of other people from Birmingham, so it was still like being in the world of Birmingham because we moved there for my mother to take a job at Marquette University and work in an equal opportunity program. And then when I was 5, we moved to Cambridge, Massachusetts, for my mother to go to graduate school at Harvard at the Graduate School of Education. And so my life became this movement back and forth from, in the summertime I was in Birmingham with my family, and my family still overwhelmingly lives in Alabama. Like, we are not a great migration family, except for my mother and a handful of other people. So I was going back and forth over the course of my life and seeing, both feeling very rooted in my tradition and also very aware of the distinctions between the spaces. And one of the things that one of the most powerful examples I would say is the life expectancy between Alabama and Massachusetts. I think the gap is 12 years. Simply by virtue of being born in Alabama, you're expected to live 12 years shorter than Massachusetts, right? So to see inequality in such dramatic, and it's racial, but it's not just racial. It's racial, it's class, it's occupational, it's policy. So when I tell people in other states that you don't have to have your car inspected in Alabama, they are stunned. And I'm like, no, all kind of emissions are in the air. And I'll say also, I was diagnosed with a chronic disease, with lupus. I was 23 years old. I believe in most people in my family over the age of 40 have some form of chronic disease. I think it's because at the year when I was born, Birmingham was the single most polluted city in the country because of the steel mills and the coal mines, right? And so it even is in the body. And so as I became an intellectual and a scholar, I was actually living in my flesh and in my love relationships with the people who are in my family. I was living the things I wanted to, that I was studying, right? Living the reality of inequality, but also living the incredible beauty, because I grew up homesick all the time across a year, yearning for the beauty of home, right? And so even that, so then when I went to Yale undergrad, and I, did graduate work at Harvard and law school and American studies. And everything I studied connected to my origin in one way or another, right? And it was this duality. I wanted to understand how deep injustice and inequality were, in particular with the focus on black folks and black folks in the United States, but also the incredible beauty that I felt shaped me. I'd say, I never stopped saying I was from Alabama, even though I left when I was young, in part because not just that's where my family was, but that's where I learned to walk, talk, dance, and read, right? That's the core. And so, so that sense of identity has shaped every aspect of who I've become as a thinker and a writer. Yeah.
That was so beautiful. Even outside of what you said, your voice, just keep talking to me, keep talking. So let's take this notion of identity, right? Your work looks at black bodies, right? And not in the way that so many of us have become accustomed to exploring and understanding the black body. I often talk to my students about black boy joy and how excited I am to see all of the hair, even before y'all cut it off senior year, when you get ready to head back into that world. We'll talk about that too, right? But just those moments where we're able to capture and celebrate the fullness of our humanity. Can you talk a little bit about how that shows up in your work?
Oh, everywhere. I think I try to begin. Most of what I write is about black folks in one way or another, but I begin with the terms of our lives. So I'll give you. This is an example. It's a little bit sideways example, but it's been on my mind. I was speaking at a Black Student Union. A couple days ago, of a private high school in Boston. And so we had a conversation. After the conversation, several of the students came up to me and they said, I always, in various ways, I have imposter syndrome, or I feel inadequate compared to white students, and I feel like we underperform. And I kept saying I said, you have to understand what it requires for you to be in this environment makes you 10 times smarter than any of the white students here. And that's in a particular kind of academic environment, but that's also a great deal about this world, the society, right? You have to navigate multiple languages. You have to navigate multiple communities. You have to develop your sense of aspirations and hope over and against all of the messaging that's coming at you, all the stories about who you are, sometimes coming at you from your own people, right? And so that's what I mean, starting with who I like to think about what it is that we do, not in a kind of negative comparison, but actually from what you said, there's sort of the beauty, the joy, an interior sense of the skills that we have to acquire and the like. And I also am and there's this way of talking about racism in our society that troubles me. I know it's a kind of argument, but sometimes people reduce our whole existence to racism. And one that actually makes you not understand how terrible racism is, if we're nothing but that. But also, the story is extraordinary because we're not just that. We've withstood all of the horror and violence and diminishment and ugliness not only withstood it, but we have the entire world watching us, fascinated, fixated, compelled, right? Like, and that is, I mean, we're a model. I often say we have become a model of the very, the most extraordinary example of human capacity, right? What we are able to do against all odds, right? So for me, that's the baseline. That's the ground on which we stand. Yeah.
That's so good. It's so good. So we've talked a little bit about Dr. Perry. We've talked about the baseline of how she approaches her work. And I think this is really important to you all, at whatever your major is, whatever your discipline is, because when you show up, all of you is showing up. And so what I'm hopeful that we're able to accomplish in this brief time that we have together today is that you recognize it is okay, and I would argue necessary, for all of you to show up in these spaces, okay? And you get mixed messages, right? And we understand our families are giving us the best advice they have, right? Our professors are giving us the best advice they have, but you're the ones that are dealing with 2026 in ways that I'm not gonna understand. I'm already invested. I tell my students, I'm invested in my mortgage, I gotta pay tuition, like I'm attached to these structures differently than you all are. So you really are the hope for the future. But in so doing, I need you to take all of you with you, which means you gotta critically examine what all of you is. So I wanna start off, I know we have Dr. Taylor's class in here, right? Dr. Taylor's? No, Dr. Taylor? Okay. Well, we're gonna talk about the Great Migration anyway. Is everyone familiar with the term, the Great Migration? Okay. Dr. Perry.
Yes.
Can you talk to us a little bit about the Great Migration?
Sure, I'd be happy to. So has anybody seen Good Times? Oh, there we go. Okay. So, my favorite episode of Good Times, and it's so funny because it's actually the episode where James dies, but I separate the first and, right, damn, right. I separate the sections of it because the beginning, they're about to move back south. And they encounter a family on the way that is moving to Chicago. And then they both say to each other, go back, right? And the point is that, right, so the Great Migration is driven primarily by the boll weevil, which is destroyed crops so that black folks who've done agricultural labor, and there's two moves over the course of the early 20th century, but there's just not work. And it's one of the things people don't talk about is that white Southerners migrated at the same rate. So when they were going to these northern cities, the white Southerners were following them, right? At the same time.
We can't have anything.
Huh?
I said, we can't have anything.
No, not at all. And and then what they found in many places, there was this hope that outside of the logic of a society that was organized by Jim Crow, that greater equality would exist. There were some things that were possible, like voting, right, for example, right? But also what they confronted in many locations was just a distinct form of racial injustice. So I'll give Chicago as an example. So Good Times, they're in these, they're supposed to be based on Cabrini Green. Super. Anybody here from Chicago? Okay, right. So Cabrini, I used to go to the Y across the street from Cabrini, these super tall housing projects. My dad lived in Chicago. The reason the projects were built so tall in Chicago is because most of the land in the city was covered by what were called racially restrictive covenants. Those were basically agreements between property owners that said, we promise we won't rent to black folks or let black folks buy any property here. So if you imagine you go up to a city, you're thinking you're going to have the possibility of different kinds of jobs and not be Jim Crowed, and you literally cannot live in most parts of the city. And so first there were, people were living largely in slums, and oftentimes they would be, there were kitchenettes. If anybody has seen the play A Raisin in the Sun, Okay. So, so they're in this kitchenette. What basically happened is that there would be apartment buildings that were supposed to be 3 apartments. They chop them up into 9. One hallway on at the end of the bathroom, and you'd have like these little tiny apartments. So Raising the Sun is in a kitchenette, right? Also, the great poet Gwendolyn Brooks, if you know her, she wrote a really important poem called Kitchenette Building that tells you what life was like in kitchenettes. So first there were these kitchenettes, and then the development of housing projects. And so I mention all that to say the Great Migration was a dream and then its deferral, right? A promise. And that's part of A Raisin in the Sun, the play by Lorraine Hansberry, took its name from a poem by Langston Hughes that initially was untitled, then it was called Harlem, and it was called What Happened, it goes, what happens to a dream deferred? How does it go? Does it dry up like a raisin in the sun, or fester like a sore and then run? Does it stink like rotten meat, or crust and sugar over like a syrupy sweet? Maybe it just sags like a heavy load, or does it explode, right? And so the promise of the Great Migration and then the denial of that promise is this important feature in Black history. And now what we're seeing over the past couple decades is a reverse migration, that so Black communities in Los Angeles, for example, have large numbers of people moving back south. Lots of folks in the Northeast moving back south. Why? Because given the economic inequality in northern cities, the South is seen and is actually in many places a place where you can have a better quality of life compared to many of those migration destinations. I'm sorry, was that close to what you were looking for? Okay, yeah. So in my work, I've looked at the migration. I've tried to look at it in a way that I feel like is not romanticized, because I think lots of people want to tell the story. And if you go to the National Museum of American History in D.C., they have an exhibit on the Great Migration, but they don't tell anything about the denied promises of that migration. It's just like, Black people ran away from racism, and of course, right, as though there wasn't racism in those places, and then not talking about racism in those locations. And I'll just remind you, when Dr. King went to Chicago and I think it was in Cicero outside of Chicago, and had bottles thrown at his head, and he said the white folks in Mississippi could learn a thing or two about racism from the white folks in Chicago. It's absolutely true.
Wow. So some of you all are studying Great Migration, right? Because what I love about Dr. Perry's work is she adds these pieces that have been overlooked, right? Like these things that we should think about. Because when we think about the Great Migration, right, we're like, we eat that in Mississippi too. Yeah, because everybody in Chicago is also from Mississippi.
That's right.
Right? So like these connections that we have, they're not random. They're not arbitrary, but we are connected, whether you want to be or not. So yes, California, you got roots here in the Deep South. And I love the way that you talk about the South sort of being the boogeyman of all of American history. Yeah. So can you elaborate on that a little?
Sure. I love that you introduced that point. So I just want to say quickly, one of the things that's amazing is that we know, like when you go to different cities, you have a good guess where people's people are from because of train routes, right? Like, so Philly, it's folks from the Carolinas, Detroit, folks from Alabama, Chicago, Mississippi, LA and the Bay is Louisiana and Texas, and it's literally just that people follow along train routes. And I'm always, and then this other thing, and this is relevant for what you just asked me. The migration is also to the urban South, right? So it's to northern cities, but people migrated from the plantation South, the rural communities to urban communities, which is really important. So my family is originally from Huntsville, Alabama, when it was rural, not now, which is when it's the biggest city. And, yeah, right. And migrated to Birmingham. My grandmother first went to Nashville and then went to Birmingham with my grandfather. And most of the rest of the country, every time, well, let me see how I want to say this. So, on social media, which is, a mess in general, but there are moments when people will say things like, oh, they'll look at the political landscape and they say, let's just get rid of the South. And first of all, that bothers me because it is still the case that over 50% of black folks live in the South. Always been the case that the majority of black Americans live in the South. And that's part of the tricky thing about so much emphasis on the Great Migration is people don't realize, it's weird, people are like, oh, early 20th century, all the black people moved north and everybody was in Harlem, and then something happened during the 60s, people somehow were still left in the South, right? Yeah. And so it still is the root of our culture, our population. And other regions, particularly white folks in other regions, I think are comfortable making the South into a boogeyman because it allows them to deny the racism that exists in their regions. But also, it allows people to tell a story of the country which is separated from the history of American slavery, which is false, or the history of Jim Crow, which is false. James Baldwin used to say his first time in the South was when he was in New Jersey. Because that's where he experienced Jim Crow for the first time, right? And so that it's just a fallacy that, things weren't always legally segregated, but they were still segregation was enforced. And yes, some of the most horrific parts of American history took place vis-a-vis our experiences took place in the South, but that's because this is the region that was most abundant, and the reason slavery lasted in the South longer is because of the climate, right, and what could grow here, and the wealth of the country was built because there's this massive group of unfree laborers and black people. The South, and this is part of what I've tried to write about, is that the South and the Caribbean were once considered a single region. All of this prosperity, all the European powers, England, Spain, Portugal, France, they're fighting to harness the power of this region. And the way they chose to harness the power is to create slave-based societies, right? And for me, that's also why I don't start, when I tell the story of this country, I don't start even from a black perspective in 1619. I start in the 1500s because black folks were here earlier because of the history of enslavement. And once we add France and Portugal, and that's important because if anybody's from Florida, that's a direct part. That's a direct part of our history, or the Carolinas, or Louisiana, or Mobile, Alabama. Yeah.
I feel like y'all are missing what she's throwing right now. I think we've tapped into something that connects to each of you, right? We've talked about different states, different coasts, different cities. So what I want is for this to marinate with you in a real particular way. This is a very heavy academic, but her work touches each of us, right? And this is what we expect of you. No pressure. No pressure. This is what we expect of you. So we're going to keep this piece of the conversation going. I know we have some Gullah Geechee scholars in here. Gullah Geechee? I thought...
Right here, this brother right here.
Okay. Can you talk a little about the Gullah Geechee experience in particular and why we should all care about it?
Sure. Also, can y'all get together some questions? I would love to bring some of them in conversation.
Perfect.
Yeah. I have been interested in Gullah Geechee culture for a very long time because the folks who were enslaved in the islands off the coast of South Carolina and Georgia had a different experience than most enslaved populations in what is the United States, because they existed on large plantations that often didn't have many white folks nearby. And so much more of the language and culture of West Africa, West and Central Africa, was intact. And spiritual traditions, religious traditions, there's a really fascinating set of examples of actually Islamic scholars who were enslaved. There's a long-standing Muslim tradition in those regions. And so to this day, we see the language that's still intact there. We see the foodways are still intact there. Two other pieces. One is that many of the folks who were enslaved on those islands, if they did not come directly from West Africa, came from Barbados. So it's also one of those places where there's a real direct connection to the Caribbean. Another interesting example of a flip of that is many of the people who are Bahamian come from folks who were originally enslaved in South Carolina and then settled Bahamas. So there's all this movement back and forth between these places. And I like that. I like the history both because it's incredibly beautiful language, music, art, food, incredible food, but also because it's just one of these examples where we can remember that we're so much more expansive than the general stories tell us, right? That we are connected to each other. We have these long, complicated movements that we've taken. It's a reminder to ask your grandparents and your elders about their stories and where they come from, because oftentimes we won't know. Or we'll just be like, oh, that's a person in our family just has an unusual way of speaking, right? And not realize that there's a reason behind all of that. And to trace those stories apart as part of your identity, your personal story, but also to understand who we are. There is incredible diversity amongst Black folks in this country. Right, before you even step outside of the boundaries of this country. And that's, I think, a really important thing to hold on to.
No, absolutely. So I hope y'all are thinking of some questions.
Or comments.
Or comments. Questions or comments. I'm going to bounce a little bit from the South to this notion of imagery about which you write. So in your most recent piece, you talk about the color blue.
Yeah.
Why should we care about blue? What does it mean to us?
Yeah. So, I mean, y'all should read the book. But the reason, I actually start with Gullah Geechee culture. So if you're ever in South Carolina and you notice two things that you might notice. One is that lots of porches, the ceilings of porches are painted blue. And the other is that there are trees that are often covered with blue bottles on the branches, and bottle trees. And the blue porches are called haint blue because it was believed that it would protect your home, to paint against unkind spirits. And the blue bottles on the trees would capture unkind spirits and keep them away from a form of spiritual protection. And I've always been fascinated by this, but what the book came about because I was interested in all the ways blue had this deep symbolism in Black life. Of course, the blues as a genre of music, like why is it called the blues, right? And that was part of what I wanted to explore. And it really is like a way of telling Black history through looking at these symbols of the color blue in the book I wrote. And I'm always interested in telling Black history in unconventional ways that like bring people in, through music, through art, through language. One of the funniest examples in the book is that they used to say that you couldn't find a blue jay on Fridays anywhere. These old folks used to say this because that was the day that the birds went down to hell to report on how evil white folks were. And it's just, and what I love about it is that one, it's funny, but two, it's like it's really important to know that we understood that racial injustice was evil always. Right? Not, people passively accepted their condition, right? So you say, yeah, that, they reported to their master about how evil they were. And then there's the other thing is that they used to say that if a black person with blue gums bit you, you would die. This is, and black folks used to say this, isn't it, right? And the thing is, this was so widely repeated that it was. I found it even in dental journals in the 19th century that dentists would be like, "We've heard this report about black people with these gums; they could kill you. We haven't backed up the evidence." Now, of course, now we know that anybody, if they bite you, might kill you because there's so much bacteria in the human mouth. And so it was in effect, so it wasn't false, it's just it had nothing to do with black people and blue gums. But it was also this sense of power, right? Because imagine, so if people believe this, particularly if white folks hear this and believe this, and black folks are taking care of babies and drawing their bathwater and cooking their food, that someone that close to you could bite you and kill, it's a way of wielding a kind of power. And I'm always interested in all the different ways that people resisted and developed. So blue just courses through a way of thinking about our history and culture in lots of different ways. And it's fun to write. Yeah.
Can y'all think about some of the phrases we say that have blue in it, like blue black?
Blue black.
Can y'all think of some? I can't really see your faces. Yes? The color blue is meaningful to us, even outside of the blues, right? There's so many things that just blue signifies, right? And there's scholarship about that. So the other sort of ulterior motive that I have today is to encourage you to lean on other scholars. So I'm going to ask Dr. Perry to talk about the influence of Baldwin and Lorraine Hansberry, which she's written beautifully about. And then I think I saw a hand with a question. So if you could talk a little bit about some of the influences from other scholars?
Yeah, and I will. I love that you mentioned Hansberry and Baldwin, and I'll start with them, but other people might come up as we talk more. I wrote a biography of Lorraine Hansberry, who wrote A Raisin in the Sun, and I wrote about her because for a bunch of reasons. One, I think her work. She's the first black woman to have a play on Broadway, and she died when she was 34 years old. Died of cancer. She was an extraordinary intellectual, wrote brilliant essays and plays, and wrote some fiction, but there are parts of her story that meant a lot to me. One is that she came from this very bourgeois family in Chicago. Her father actually was one of the entrepreneurs who built the kitchenettes, right? Carl Leo Hansberry, went to Alcorn, migrated up to Chicago. Her father was from Mississippi, her mother was from Tennessee, and he became very prosperous. But when she grew up and she came of age, she actually was not invested in sort of being a bourgeois person. She wanted to see herself as connected to black folk, regular folk. And when they lived, so when she was 8 or 9 years old, her father figured out how to buy a house. Remember I was talking about racially restrictive covenants. Her father figured out how to buy a house in a neighborhood that was restricted for white people. Then the people in the neighborhood sued him to remove them from the house. So he went back and forth in the lawsuit. And ultimately her father won, and that they could stay in the house, but it didn't actually change the law around restrictive covenants. They just basically said that white folks had not entered the agreement properly. But her point, as an adult, she said, okay, so we won, and it didn't change anything. And then her father was so depressed, he was going to move the family to Mexico, but he had a brain aneurysm when he was there looking for a home, and he died. Right? And so for her, one, she didn't see this sort of this aspiration. She wasn't now that interested in desegregation. She wasn't all that invested in sort of being upper class as a black person. She was interested, and she loved the way she said when people would talk, the people in her neighborhood, not the other bourgeois kids, but the way that they would fight back when you insulted them, when you put that, she said that was what inspired her. And similarly, when she was real interested in political movements in other countries, but then when the Southern movement started, then she got excited about something more, about desegregation, because she said it was something more. Anyway, she was really close to Baldwin. Everybody knew about Baldwin, has known about Baldwin. She was much less known. And he would go to her and ask her to read everything that he wrote, and he would look to her for inspiration and as a model. And so that's also why I wanted to tell her story. And then the other piece is that she was closeted. She identified as lesbian, but nobody knew, and she would write these stories under a pseudonym. And it wasn't until I was the first person to write about those stories, because her papers had been kept secret for years. So, when I read, I'm going to get to answer your question, there's an inspiration. Part of the reason she's an inspiration, she was really important. There hadn't been a biography written of her. But part of why she inspired me is because when I read her journals, she had these moments of self-doubt. And she's like, I can't get it together. And she was so self-critical. And she'd done such extraordinary work. And there was something about that felt like it gave me the freedom to sort of put aside self-doubt, because her self-doubt didn't get in the way for her making these huge contributions. And so I said, okay, so everybody experiences this where you don't know if something is good or you don't know quite, and you just keep at it, so her model of courage was such a direct inspiration. Yeah. And then for someone who was ill as a young person, that was also a direct inspiration.
And you can chat about Baldwin briefly, if you would
Sure.
like.
Yeah.
I mean, naming books and stuff.
So what can I say? So Baldwin's incredible. Part of what I'm working on now, which is sort of related to Baldwin, is I'm writing about a man named Sterling Brown, who was a professor at Howard for over 40 years. And every time James Baldwin would go south, because Baldwin was from Harlem. His people were from Louisiana, and I forget where else. And when he becomes this extraordinary writer, is living in France and writing, sees the movement happening, says he has to go back to the United States. So he wrote a play and tested it out at Howard. And while he was there, he developed a relationship with his professor, Sterling Brown, an incredible English professor, but it worked with the theater. And then for the rest of his life, every time before he would go south, he would go sit at the knee of Sterling Brown and have him explain what the South was like to him. And I'm really interested in, and he would say, if I could be a teacher, that's the kind of teacher I'd want to be. And he did eventually teach at UMass Amherst, and he taught there in part because of one of Sterling Brown's other proteges, a man named Michael Thelwell, got him a job teaching there, and he got him that job because we think of Baldwin as always a superstar, but Baldwin, like King, at the end of his life, people had become very critical of him, right? And so this person who invited him to teach it at UMass Amherst told the deans, they were like, yeah, he has job offers from all these places, so you better get him, and this is how much you need to pay him. And it was all a lie, but he got him the job, which is good. But his writing inspired me because there's something about the way that he writes that is based in knowledge, but it also gets you in your heart and your gut. And I never want to write in a way that's so dry that it's just making you think. I want it also to make people feel something. I want it to connect to the inside part. And to do that, you have to be vulnerable. And he's such an extraordinary model of vulnerability on the page. You feel him struggling through stuff, and it's part of. And then he's saying these brilliant things, but the thing that pulls you in is that you can feel the sentences.
That's powerful. So I'm seeing hands. This is great. We'll start with you, Trayvon. You were first. There's a microphone here. Issa, do y'all want to walk up to the mic or? Okay, well, come on, make your way on down. Never mind. Thank you, Issa. So if you all would like to form a line behind Trayvon, that would be great. And thank y'all for your engagement. Trayvon's taking his sweet time to make it down to the microphone, dapping everybody up. All right, Trey.
Okay. Hello, Dr. Perry. Hello, Dr. Wiltshire. Thank you so much, Dr. Perry, for taking the time to speak with us and converse. My name is Trayvon Henderson. I'm a senior sociology major from Cleveland, Ohio. So when you mentioned Detroit, I was hoping you would throw Cleveland in there, but you didn't. It's okay. Okay, no laugh. But my question was really about the significance of you imploring home in your writing. And you mentioned it a little bit earlier, but throughout your writing, I can see the significance of you creating a space or a sense of home for the reader. And as you even expressed how it's significant for them to feel and not just to acknowledge things, I wanted to ask, how did that come to be with part of your writing style?
Thank you. That's a beautiful question. Part of it is just organic. You know, my grandmother's home was the only place that I ever called home. And I say was because the night before my last book was launched, our home burned down. And it's devastating. I'm still grieving it, but it's everything that I ever have done is connected to my grandmother and her life and the space she made. And so it's just organic that it kept. But I also, it's one of those things that I like, you know, it's a humble home, but an unbelievably beautiful one, filled with photographs, filled with love, filled with our family's history. But like, for example, when I write about restrictive covenants, we were the third black family on that block because that part of Birmingham was covered by an agreement that black people couldn't live there. And then, so we're the third family. And then when we were kids, there was one white man left in the neighborhood because, of course, once there's three, they all left. And he would have a sign in his yard that says "Zone for Whites." And so the boys in the neighborhood would kick the sign down on the way to school. He would put it back up, and it's great. So really, like everything, it's the root of everything. And I think for me, the style comes from wanting to be honest. But I love what you said because everybody can connect to some sense of home. And so it is something that I hope resonates with readers.
Thank you so much.
Good afternoon. My name is Elijah Qualls. I'm a junior political science and journalism double major from Columbus, Ohio. And so my question to you is, I guess personal, but I hope it relates to maybe some other people in the room as well. I feel like in all of my work that I've done so far here at Morehouse College, I find myself getting tired of inspecting race and coming to similar conclusions. And I fear that fatigue is causing me to go a different direction as far as my future is concerned. I plan on getting my PhD in political science, but I'm noticing that I'm getting tired of looking at American politics because it oftentimes is coming back to race, particularly being here at Morehouse College. And as someone who loves to write, I just feel like I'm starting to go away from the things that I should be writing. Like I'm not writing about race as much because it's just exhausting. And so my question to you is, for someone who's been doing this for as long as you have and you've been doing it at the highest level, what advice do you have for us men of Morehouse who are getting tired and who are getting worn down? How are we supposed to stay persistent to continue inspecting and delivering these important messages for the society?
Yeah, it's such a profound question. And I don't know if it's something that I can answer for you. You know, I mean, I think I love the way Baldwin put it, you have to go the way your blood beats, right? Which is, you know, there are some things that are unsustainable. And it could be the case that for you, working on race is not something that is sustainable for the long time. And there's lots of other ways to do meaningful work. I don't, more of my work is on blackness than about race. And that for me is precisely because of what you said, because of what you say. But I also think a part of the exhaustion is, I think, shaped by, it's an exhausting world, and right now it's really exhausting, but part of the exhaustion is shaped by this sense, I think, is when we are reduced to the racism, right? That's the only story to tell. And it also, just different disciplines lend themselves to different ways of thinking about it, right? Some disciplines have room for imagining more broadly than our story just in terms of adversity, right? And you just have to find that. You have to find the path. You have to find what not only feels important, but also has some joy in doing it, right? Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Hi, nice to meet you. My name is Corey Graham, sophomore, religion, sociology, double major, philosophy minor from Queens, New York. Your words really hit home for me, and they connected to me because my grandpa, he's also from Bama. He grew up in Goodwater, Alabama. He had 6 siblings, and then he was part of the Great Migration, moved up to Harlem, then bounced to Brooklyn, and ended up in Queens, and that's where I grew up.
Queens, you said?
Yeah, Queens, New York.
Mm-hmm.
And some of the other things that you said as far as when the Europeans came over here and they looked at the South, it felt connected to the Caribbean as well. Like they were looking at that whole region. And that also hit home as well because I have a Caribbean background on my mom's side. My grandma, she's from Haiti, right? So constantly, like, I always hear discourse on the internet about how different our cultures are, but I've always felt a connection to both sides. Like hearing my grandma's stories, hearing my great aunt's stories about how they had a way with the land, and how like there's this unspoken connection between just all black people across the diaspora. So my question to you would be, what have you seen as far as all the cultures that you've seen across the diaspora? What was some reoccurring things as far as liberation that black people have commonly done all across the diaspora, all across the years?
Oh, what a beautiful question. This is part of what writing about blue has allowed me to do. But I think Haiti is a beautiful example because the Haitian Revolution they were the first free, right? It inspired the entire black world. At the time when the Haitian Revolution took place, black people, because the globe had been colonized, black people weren't really considered citizens anywhere, even in their own land, right? And so that inspiration, that idea of freedom, took hold. And it led to greater repression in many places. It led to greater insurrection, greater repression. So it's like one of these examples about how our cultures are intertwined in terms of ideas of freedom. And then another example, in which I wrote about, is when Patrice Lumumba, who was a freedom fighting leader in the Congo, when he was assassinated, again, the entire black world was enraged because we had, taken inspiration from that particular person. And then there are just the literal cultural connections, right? So that I said before about the Bahamians being largely in origin black people from South Carolina, the other portion is from Haiti, right? So the Bahamas has Haitian and South Carolinian black culture involved. Louisiana and Haiti having such a deep connection. And in post-Haitian Revolution, lots of people coming from Haiti to New Orleans, for example. And so there are so many stories like that. So you get like language similarities. If you listen to Haitian Creole and New Orleans Creole, they sound very similar, right? They're different languages in some ways, but they sound very similar. There are all these ways that various terms or speech patterns. So for example, I'm being long-winded. Here's a quick example. So Black English or African American Vernacular English or Ebonics, whatever you want to call it, right, has English vocabulary, but the structure of West African languages, right? And though that structure you see in languages throughout the Caribbean as well. So the very way that we put together sentences, even if they're not always mutually intelligible, we can't always understand each other, right? But they actually have structural similarities because they have the sort of common root. Thank you.
I appreciate that answer. I'm trying to disregard what you were just saying, but I was also wondering about liberation-wise. Like, what are some things, common trends that you've
liberation
seen?
movements?
Like, what have you seen similar from like the Haitian Revolution, the South, all those type of things?
Oh, thank you for clarifying. I appreciate that. I mean, I think that the idea of freedom, right, which is pretty universal, and having an idea of freedom, and this varies. Like, it's hard, people have different visions, but, and I'll add in South Carolina. After the Civil War, the vision of freedom that people on the Sea Islands had was not one about private property and private wealth, but they actually developed these systems of collective ownership, right, people who had been enslaved. And that was dismantled quite deliberately. And the notion of an idea of freedom that isn't just about individual gain, but community prosperity is something that you see over and over again. You see that in the context of the Haitian Revolution that winds up being destabilized. It's a complicated history, but that's a piece of it. You saw it in the Congo, saw it in Grenada in the 60s when there was this under the leadership of Maurice Bishop. There's all these examples of visions of freedom where there is collective prosperity and well-being and not just individual wealth, and deep economic sharing as well as democracy. I would say those are the repeated themes. It's not every example, but quite frequent. And oftentimes those have been destabilized by global powers.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, Dr. Perry. Good afternoon, Dr. Welcher. My name is Christopher Lambry Jr. I'm a junior political science major on a pre-law track from Atlanta, Georgia. First and foremost, I want to thank you for engaging in such wonderful dialogue with us today. I'm currently reading Black and Blues.
Thank you.
Yes, very brilliant book. And I think one of the many things that I'm taking away from the book currently is that it sort of challenges us, I think, or it invites us at least to question the way in which we sort of perceive our communities and the way in which we take it in, at least. And for me, that was a little bit what you shared about your grandmother's house and just home. And for me, it sort of invited me to think about two things more specifically, our connection with water, right? This idea of blue and this deep sort of connection with water. And I thought about there's this beautiful exhibit, and I know Trayvon, he can probably talk a little bit about it. There's this beautiful exhibit in the Boston Museum of Fine Arts, and it's called the Deep Waters exhibit. And it brings in conversation, this idea of water and the relationship with our people, jazz and the blues, and it's a beautiful composition, I think. So that was the first thing, but secondly, there's a novel by Sibo Campbell, The Sky Full of Elephants, and he brings in conversation the idea of sort of water and its connection with blue being sort of a defense, if you will, right? If people aren't familiar, The Sky Full of Elephants is a novel where it sort of sets off in every white person in America wakes up one day and they walk to the nearest body of water and drown themselves. So it's a bit, but the basis there is that there's this deep connection with our people and water and blue. And so I wanted to ask, I thought the book was brilliant in that you peel back these sort of complex layers of our people, the color blue, and I wanted to see what was the intention behind that? How did you sort of arrange sort of the pieces to put this together, and why was that important to share with us in that sort of specific way?
Yeah, thank you. One thing that story that Sibo Campbell tells is, of course, based in a story in the Gullah Geechee Islands. It's an inversion of the story of Igbo landing, which is a story in which a folktale that was told. Although there's something that happened. It's just your interpretation of the event is dependent upon your faith system, I guess. But the idea is that the Igbo where a group of Igbo were brought to, I think it's in one of the Georgia Sea Islands. They're brought, Igbo landings on St. Simon's. And they're brought there, and they look and they see the plantation, and they, instead of being willing to work on the plantation, they turn their backs and walk into the water. Now, white reporters of the time called it a mass suicide.
Yeah.
Other people said that they walked back through the water back to West Africa. And other stories said that they flew, that they turned around and they flew in the air, right? And so it's a kind of inversion of that story, which is really interesting. You know, I think in some ways it's hard to answer that question because it came to me, like there's a lot of craft, but it came to me that this is an important theme. And then I wanted to put it together in the tradition out of which we come, right? So I wanted the book to read like a jazz composition.
Yeah.
I wanted the book to read like a quilt, right? And quilting is an enormous part of our cultural tradition. And quilts have like pieces of different sizes and different textures. And the quilting tradition is huge in Alabama. This is part of the story. So, and then there's, like you said, there's all these examples in the literature, right? There are characters called blue all through Black literature, from Jesmond Ward to Toni Morrison, you know. So it was sort of putting the threads together and trying to stitch together composition. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Hi, Dr. Perry. Hi, how are you? Hi, Dr. Watcher. My name is Noah Cathy. I'm a sophomore at Morehouse College, originally from Dallas, majoring in journalism and social justice, minoring in sociology. The goal is to be a lawyer. I have so many questions, but I'll save one for this conversation. My mom has actually read to me Breathe, a letter to my son. So yeah. But the question is about hip hop, about prophets of the hood. I was recently writing and kind of thinking about what I kind of want to research, things that I'm engaged in, and particularly the way hip hop is both culturally understood and weaponized, like the misinterpretation of it can be weaponized. And your book talks about how, I believe you say music is never compositionally pure, rather it's like it's an amalgamation of cultures or something along those lines. And recently, particularly in the news with the recent cases, but of course your book details the history of it, how in court and the news and lyrics can be misunderstood or misinterpreted by people that they weren't meant to be for. And that lack of understanding can be weaponized. And so I wanted to talk, one, about just kind of the importance of hip hop to our community, but also kind of because of its capitalistic nature, it's now being interpreted and produced by people that it was never meant to cater to. And so we've lost some of its meaning, but also the lyrics that rappers offer or artists offer actually are being taken by us, even those of us who they have things in common with, in ways they never meant for them to be understood. And so how has Blackness both been weaponized in that way, but also how are we as Black people doing a disservice to the hip hop culture in the ways that we engage with it?
Yeah, so such a good question and a complicated one. And I'll just say before I begin, so Prophets of the Hood is over 20 years old, so there's a lot of this change in hip hop that I haven't, that it doesn't get to. But what you said, I think is really right? So one is, the largest consumers of hip hop are not Black people, right? The most voracious consumers of hip hop are young white men. And so there is a pressure on rappers and it's placed by record companies to feed the fantasies of Black life to young white men, right? And what is tricky is that even though there's all this emphasis on being authentic and real, right, that is on hip hop, there's also this push to have that authenticity. Like there's not a lot of hip hop songs about what it means for a grandmother to have to be on the bus to buy groceries, right? Like there's a lot that happens in Black life that doesn't wind up in hip hop. So the audience feeds it. The people who own the record companies feed what we consume, and we have a responsibility, I think, to look at it critically and to vote with our attention. Because one thing we do know is that whatever Black folks are paying attention to, the rest of the world decides you pay attention to it too, right? So I think that critical piece is important. I'd also say but there's also this way that it's seen as like a kind of power, right, that we want to be able to harness, and that power can boomerang and hurt us. So I've acted as an expert witness in court cases where prosecutors want to use a defendant who's in the cases I've done, they've been capital cases, right, where they're accusing someone, young black man, of murder or similar crime. They want to use their lyrics as evidence that they committed the crime, right? And so as an expert witness, what I do is come in and I basically say, these lyrics are actually standard in hip hop. Like, people talk about killing people all the time. Doesn't mean they did it, right? But then you have to think about, what does it mean to have the most popular art form be one in which there's a lot of talk about killing people? And that is something that we have to develop, I think, a political maturity about. It took me a long time to be able to say that, because I'm like, we live in a very violent culture, a very misogynistic culture, and the only people who they talk about it with is us, right? It's like and I still know that's true, but then the other side of that is, okay, but then what is going to serve us best? And so I like your question, because I think these are the kind of questions, this is what we have to grapple with. And we have to grapple with it in part by making decisions about what we're going to allow to be in our heads 24/7.
So just like I said, a brief follow-up, like, do you think we should continue to cling to it if it has been posed as a danger historically and currently? Like, in what ways should we still engage with it, like, as a way to preserve the art form and its importance to our culture without continuing to paralyze ourselves in mobility?
Yeah, I mean, I think that we have to be open to and looking for, I don't think we should reject hip hop, but I think that we have to make decisions about what kind we want to listen to, and have discussions about what we're hungry for and why, and also just internal discussions, why something is so appealing to us. Sometimes it is the fantasy of it and wanting to imagine, a release of one's frustrations or challenges. It's hard for me to say whether or not we should. I will say this: we have to engage multiple forms of art, and so it should not have as huge a sort of hold on us.
Thank you.
So it is 2:15.
Class time? Okay.
I'm sorry, yeah, so but y'all stay in line. So I'm gonna, Dr. Perry, if you'd be willing to still respond to the questions. So before you all leave, please give Dr. Perry a just resounding round of applause.
Thank you all for being here. Appreciate you. And thank you so much.
Thank you. No, thank you for sharing your brilliance with us today. So just come on up here and just ask questions. If you have to leave, leave. If you're able to stay, please stay.
You want us to use the mic? I'm Brian Coleman. I'm a sociology major and a criminology minor from Prattville, Alabama. First off, I just wanted to pay tribute for a scholar and a doctor's you. You're from Alabama, and coming to Morehouse, a lot of people say you from Alabama? They like to make the cousin jokes and all that kind of
Can I say this?
Yeah.
Atlanta is a city where you can see all these streets named for people from Alabama.
Right, exactly. So a lot of your work reminded me of a study done by William Julius, I think it's Truly Disadvantaged, and how he was talking about in Alabama there were laws put in place so people couldn't stay in certain housing and neighborhoods and zoning policies that kept us from getting where we need to be. I want to go in law enforcement, and I want to know what is something I could be proactive in when it comes to doing things proactive for my people, because what I know is in zones like 1, 3, and 4, those are the worstest places to police in, and those are the communities that have project units, gang activity. We all know where that stuff stems from and what is put on black people, but what is something in that line of work that I could do, because I aim to climb the ladder of administration. So in that, I want to put policies and community-based policing and solutions in place that'll help my people while I'm in that profession. So what's something I could fix?
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing to do, and I don't know this professional world, I think it's really important to identify a model. There's a man named Philip Atiba Goff who teaches at Yale, who does work on reform of policing that actually is based in connections, larger connections to communities, so that the only encounter with law enforcement is punitive, and law enforcement is not working with the other agencies of government to sort of reimagine what the right, so that it doesn't make sense to punish people for making a living when there are no jobs, right? And so to try to imagine how to have collaborative relationships, and you have to have models in the profession of people who you see who you think are doing it in a way that's more equitable. It's similar to me about the question of being a prosecutor. Like, I remember being in law school and saying my father would kill me if I became a prosecutor, but I kept saying we need black prosecutors, right, because we need people in positions who actually are going to do the work fairly, right? And so, you have to have a model to figure that out.
So in that quest, like, for instance, it's a couple of theories you could use, like when you say people use illegal means to make a way of living,
yeah,
but we prosecute people for that. What's some literature or something that I could get to? I understand it, but a lot of my people, they don't understand where law enforcement comes from. Like, for instance, we could have a budget for law enforcement. A lot of people don't know that a certain part of a law enforcement budget goes back to the people in those communities, like programming. Like, I'm an intern at the Fulton County Sheriff's Office. We go to those low-income communities. We give out Thanksgiving baskets. We give out book bags and things. Other than a handout, what is something that I could do for my people and get to them so we could get them in a better place?
Yeah, it's complicated. It's really hard. I do think that one of the things, and I like that here's the question. If the incentive, if you have a structure there's an incentive, right? I'll give you an example from Chicago. In Chicago, there was a group of police officers who were responsible for the Stateway Garden Housing Project. Mm-hmm. They were called the Skull Cap Crew. And they brutalized people in those projects. And they kept getting promoted. So they were rewarded for and there were thousands of complaints from the community. And they kept getting promoted. So if you have an incentive structure that rewards brutality, right? So my inclination would be to have, if you're in that career, to clean up some of that behavior. It's also the case the blue code of silence has got to end. You cannot and this is in multiple professions, but if there is protection of the bad actors, then everybody is implicated. You know what I mean? So that, for me, is the most important kind of intervention, is to actually just an ethical intervention in law enforcement. Thank you.
We'll talk about it in the wire class.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
My name is Xavier Woodhouse. I'm a junior double major in sociology and education from the south side of Chicago. Okay. So my question stems from you talking about living through the things that you were writing about and researching. And for me, that came up, the conversation about like weathering. And so coupling that with the places that we're from being like kind of like these big markers in who we are and how we interact within the world, a conversation that comes up a lot in class is like, Dr. Wiltshire likes to say that I'm middle class bougie. And within that, there are some aspects of it where, like you said,
can I ask you where you went to high school?
I went to Butler College Prep off 103rd and Cottage. Mm-hmm. So within that, is there sometimes beauty in the things that we go through? Like you said, like there's a ways in which we romanticize the Great Migration. So within like the concept of weathering, are there some aspects of it where we can see like it is some sort of like necessary evil in some cases, to where like it provides ideas and notions about who we are as people to understand our history?
Yeah, I love that you asked that question, because I think yes and no, right? So weathering, or the costs of various kinds of injustice, I don't want to say that the fact of that is beautiful, but I do think that the spiritual resources and the knowledge that people gain in that process ought to be valued. You know, oftentimes the way people talk about injustice, we don't talk about it in terms of like these become forms of knowledge that you carry with you, and that and you know so much of the musical tradition is about that, right? I mean, that's a lot of what we find in gospel. Gospel is about a kind of spiritual sustenance that comes in the face of endurance and hardship, and life is hard. You know, my grandmother used to say, and she got this from her auntie, you weren't born to live on flower beds of ease. And by that she meant, you know, you weren't made tough for an easy life, right? You were made tough because and that, there's a truth to that, right? And so I think to testify to that, beauty is important without saying that justifies the injustice. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And that's also a question about disciplines, right? Because different disciplines give us different tools of analysis, right? So we might analyze the impact of weathering in one arena, and we also might analyze the kind of improvisation and resourcefulness that allows one to endure it in another. You know.
Okay, thank you.
Hi, good afternoon.
afternoon.
Dr. Perry, Dr. Welcher. My name is Omar Kovrov Jr. I'm a senior African Studies major, minor in political science on the JD PhD track from Columbia in South Carolina. I don't really have a question, but I do appreciate you being here. I liked your historic analysis and how you kind of shaping the emotional journey, because I feel like that's imperative. That's some of the things that I'm really interested in. But I'm on my way to my next class. I wanted to know if you would have a chance to sign. I appreciate it. Omar.
Peace and greetings, Dr. Perry, Dr. Welcher. First, I want to thank you for being here, Dr. Perry. Really appreciate your presence here today. My name is Jackson Shabazz Buckner. I'm a senior sociology major from Akron, Ohio. And, we've been talking about Baldwin all day, so I hate to, keep harping on Baldwin, but, James Baldwin said something that was very powerful to me. I believe it was a No Name in the Street. He said, why should I abandon my gods for yours? For my gods have enabled me to withstand you. And so I bring that up because I was wondering if you could touch more on this notion of blackness and spirituality. And really, I'm asking broadly, in any way you want to touch on that, I'd love to hear.
Yeah. No, I mean, so it's from that formulation. I have a section in South to America that just talks about the difference between the God of slaves and the God of masters. And I do think it's really important because, there's a reason that in our spiritual tradition, the story of Exodus is as prominent as anything in the New Testament, right? And that, that we use the sort of the religious texts, we interpret them in ways that are meaningful for our own liberation, right? And that whatever tradition we come from. And I think this is why, I believe in a deeply ecumenical relationship to spirituality. Whatever spiritual tradition gives resources to imagine liberation. I think that we do well to think about it in that way. I think the thing that's so interesting about what Baldwin did is, Baldwin didn't have formal education, right? Nor did Hansberry. Hansberry dropped out of 3 colleges. But they were both voracious readers, and for Baldwin, what was interesting is that the Bible became a primary text for him, right? So that he crafted arguments through the sort of deep reading of the Bible, right? And that became, and it's a kind of it's a common text, right? It's a universal text. So it allowed this pathway to connect with readers of all sorts, and I think that is an interesting way, because it means he took up the Bible not as a spiritual text, but also as literature, right? And that becomes a model for his work of crafting literature, which I think, so again, it's a way of thinking about spirituality more broadly than like just the doctrine.
Gotcha. No. Thank you for that, I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Hi, Dr. Perry, Dr. Welcher. Thank you for being here. I'm Jalen Shepard. I'm a senior sociology major, journalism minor from Penson, Alabama, right outside of Birmingham, Alabama. My whole family's from Birmingham, and you talked a little bit earlier about how you moved when you were young. I also moved when I was young. I moved when I was 12 to Florida, then here to Georgia. I wanted to talk about blackness and how the blackness you experienced in the different places you lived and how other people viewed that blackness
Yeah.
inspired your work. Because I know for me, experiencing blackness was different in different places, but it also connected. So I just wanted to.
Yeah, I mean, everybody, you know, everybody talks bad about Alabama. It's like, so you're sort of like, well, thank God Mississippi exists. But, and they're both extraordinary places. And so, and I mean, all, you know, I think there are similarities, right? We have language similarities. We have similarities in root because the Deep South is in so many ways the foundation of Black culture in the society, regardless of whether or not people recognize it. What was interesting for me in Boston is that, you know, Black culture in Boston is heavily Caribbean. And so people, you know, that the Caribbean are also Cape Verdean and Brazilian. So there's like, so the Black world that I occupied there is multilingual, but also people had a connection to a sense of home. And then in some ways that helped me maintain my connection to Alabama, because I also had a home I was going to, and there's a sense of a place that I was connected back to. But some of the things are, you know, like it's with small things that were similar, like, you know, the way that you dress to go for religious ceremonies, and the kind of, you know, barrettes and clamps in your hair, and ribbons, and that. So there were always these threads of similarity. The thing that was always hard for me was the sense, now they're called diaspora wars, but the sense of cultural competition, both internal to the country and across the borders of the country, that felt so demoralizing and defeating in so many ways. And it's part of the reason why I'm always lifting up Alabama, because it so often gets the short end of the stick, and it's a place that has enabled so much and has such rich tradition, but it's done so much for the world, Black people specifically. So I feel like I'm also trying to repair that misconception, you know.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, Dr. Perry,
Good
Dr.
afternoon.
Welcher. First of all, I wanted to thank you both for inviting our classes to be a part of your conversation. It was very insightful. My name is Seth Beamer. I am a junior journalism and theater performance double major from Philly by way of Jamaica.
Oh.
And mid-conversation, I was inspired to write down the phrase Boogeyman Blue, because as a filmmaker, I can't help but analyze color theory and subtext within art. Throughout this conversation, I've noticed things that you've said that have conflicted with my education from being up north, and that has caused me to be deep in thought. So the first thing you talked about was the color haint blue and painting the ceiling blue, and then having blue bottles hang from trees to capture evil spirits. That made me think about the phrase feeling blue and how, like, a lot of media pushes us away from things that could benefit us. Mm-hmm. So I started to think, like, what are other blue things in the Black community that has led us to salvation? And I was thinking about water and slaves jumping into the ocean to escape slavery and whatnot as well. And the second thing you talked about was the abundance of the South, and over 50% of people, Black people, being in the South as well. And I know, coming from up north, we were like mainly taught this notion of staying away from the South. That's where slavery came from. Mm-hmm. This is something to fear. The South, the Unions versus the Confederate, we want to stay away from that. So my question to you is, what books and practices have helped you identify and dispel the boogeyman and make your findings presentable to the Black community?
Oh, so yeah, that's a wonderful question. It's hard to think of individual books. So there's so many.
I'll write down a list. I'll take anything. So I do think reading Baldwin, reading Fire Next Time, No Name in the Street. I also think, I'm trying to think what, there's a new book, it's called, by Howard French, called Born in Blackness, which is basically retelling the story of the modern world from the African perspective. And so it's not just the story of enslavement, but it's also the story of, you know, Black people as agents in the world over the past 500 years. Do you like fiction? Mm-hmm.
I think Homegoing is interesting as a story about that's a history of, it's like an epic history of a family that has two sides, one which stays on the African continent and contemporary Ghana, and one that has other history here. I'm trying to think what else. If you email me, I'll give you a longer list because my mind is going blank right now. But I think, there's something that you said about, what did you say? You said, tell me your question again. I'm sorry. Or how you thought about this joint.
Have helped you dispel and identify the boogeyman?
Yeah, I think a lot of it is the reading of literature that emerges from the Black South, like authors like Alice Walker. Though Toni Morrison is Midwestern, right? That her novel's been helpful. Yeah, I think for the and also poetry has been really good. Like, so even just the collected volumes of various Black poets. I'm working on, as I said, writing about Sterling Brown, and he has a book called Southern Road. It was published in 1932, but it feels so contemporary. But I know it's in the library here. Although I have some books that used to be in Woodruff that were sold. So, but I think that one is still here. So, yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. What's the best way to?
It's iPerry, IPERRY at fas.harvard.edu. But also, if you just Google me on the Harvard website, you can find it. Mm-hmm.
Good afternoon, Dr. Perry. Good afternoon, Dr. Woods. I want to thank you both for sharing some of your excellence with us this afternoon. I appreciate it. My name is Damian Blackwell. I'm a graduating senior communications major, journalism minor from San Antonio, Texas.
Okay.
Earlier, Noah was asking about hip hop art, right? Kind of from the consumption side. I have aspirations, and I'm working on it now, but continuing to grow as an artist. And one thing that connects between art and hip hop, as well as in other areas, especially with writing, is being able to champion your story and tell it in an authentic and meaningful way. And I know for you, it's probably very important to be able to have pride. And I hear you speak with a lot of pride when you talk about your story, specifically coming from Alabama, but specifically in other places like that. I wanted to ask you, what has kind of helped you to champion some of that pride in your story, to tell it in an authentic and creative way? And then what helps you kind of re-fall in love with that process as well?
Oh, what a beautiful question. I mean, I think, this may not be like a completely adequate answer, but I think it's really true. Like, if you don't believe in where you come from, nobody else is going to believe it. Like, you actually have to be your own champion, and you have to have what I would call an asset-based relationship to your story, which means not just, life is hard. We all confront adversity in various ways. But there's a choice about how we interpret it, right? And if we interpret it in a way where we actually see the beauty of what it means to have endured, to have made meaningful decisions, to have made choices, to see value in who we are, to actually, so for example, and this never occurred to me, but someone said this to me recently, and I realized it was really true. Like, I could tell the story. My grandmother is one of the people who raised me. I could tell the story of her life through the lens of some kind of deficiency, right? She was a domestic. I have never seen her in that way. I've seen her as this extraordinary woman who was the smartest person I ever met, who figured out how to make a way, had a husband who was severely mentally ill, who spent the majority when she only got the right to vote when she was close to my age. I'm 53 years old, right? Who didn't finish high school, but who was brilliant, right? It is a choice for me to interpret her life and therefore who I am through that, And I'd say similarly, I have a mentee who lives in Atlanta now from years ago. I met her when she was 14 years old. She was working as a cocktail waitress at 14 years old. Her mother was addicted to crack. And I always say, like, even in the worst of circumstances, you have to figure out how to tell a story about who you are from next door in terms of the beauty that is in your life, right? So one is a story of endurance, but one thing about it, too, is that her mother was always trying to be up at the school volunteering, right? That was extraordinary, right? And I'd say to her, like, I understand there's all these things that your mother has failed to do, but look at what she's trying to do for you, right? And that, we have to figure out how to tell our stories in that way, right? And it's a very private thing, but it becomes so important for everybody else, right? Because then you teach them how to tell their stories in a way with love and respect from where they come from.
Yes, Mom. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hey, Dr. Perry. Hey, Dr. Wiltshire. I'm Jeremiah Luther. I'm a senior sociology major from Tuscaloosa, Alabama.
All right.
Yeah, but my mom and my grandma are from Bessemer in Birmingham.
Oh,
so
very close.
I spent a lot of time there. Okay. I just wanted to thank you so much about the ways that you talked about the complexities of the North and the South. You know, in any history book, I think about Sherman's March to the Sea, and they're kind of like the heroes. But my family on my dad's side are from Georgia, and they talk about how there was nothing for them to eat when that happened. Right. And so to be able to tell that story much more, with so much more complexity, it gave me the ability to articulate it in ways I didn't know how. So I just want to thank you so much for that.
That's a beautiful story, though. Thank you. Yeah.
How you doing?
How you doing?
My name is Carter Darnell. I'm a senior sociology major from San Antonio, Texas.
Okay. You were patient. Thank you.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay.
I thoroughly enjoyed listening to you today and all the great things that you had to say. I also I'm very grateful for you taking time out to come down here to small, low Morehouse College.
Distinguished Morehouse College.
Distinguished small Morehouse College. But I wanted to ask you about your writing process. I wanted to ask specifically what sustained you as a writer, and if you could take us into your writing process. It's something that I've struggled with during my time here.
Yeah.
Somebody that deals with complex issues, as you have. Like, could you take me into like what it is like to write at the level that you write?
That's such a great question. Thank you. I mean, so here's the thing. Like, I love to write, right? And so it is pleasurable to me, but it is also hard, right? I think anything that you want to do and become good at is you have to figure out how to find the joy in it, which means that you have to find your own process. Like, there are people who are like, I'm going to get up at 7 o'clock every day and I'm going to write for 3 hours. That would never work for me, right? What does work for me is, as I'm walking, as I'm going through my day, as ideas come in my head, I jot them down, right? And I allow my mind to wander on a given subject, which in the context of school, that means you cannot wait till the last minute. Like, you have to let it marinate for a while. And I do, so I'm allowing the ideas, like, and it's driven by curiosity. Like, what do I want to figure out about this thing, right? And then I do a lot of outlining. Because if I have a structure, then I'm not likely to go off on a weird tangent for a long time, right? And then if I'm trying to figure out, okay, these are my major points, I want to put the best one first, right? This is when you're writing with an argument in mind. Like, there's different types of argument, but I want to put the best point first. Then I want to think about, well, if the person disagrees with me, what would they be saying, and how would I be thinking about answering the person who disagreed with me? So it's like a multi-step process, and to look at it from different angles. And then there's a quotation from my friend who's a writer, K.S.A. Lehman, where he's always saying writing is revising, and it really is, right? Like, you want to get that stuff on the page, and then you have to go back into it. I always read things aloud, because I want to hear how it sounds, right? And sometimes when it's just your eyes, you jump over things that don't make any sense because you correct it in your brain instead of on the page. And so speaking, it slows you down and helps you refine the work. I think it's good if you have people you trust who you can exchange writing with, like people you're close. It's good to have those people. And it's also good to understand that it's a process that, like, if you stay with it, you get better. And also, I think writing is reading. Like, when you read, you're actually learning more about the craft of writing. And reading is a muscle that is in the current moment. It's kind of hard to develop. It's so important. So I'm always like 10 minutes a day, 15 minutes a day. Just get the practice, the ritual, because reading helps you become a better writer. It really does. Not everybody has to do it to be a good writer, but it really does help.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And thank you. We appreciate you. Thank you, everybody.
Thank y'all for staying.